Hello, everyone. It is 1 p.m., so we're going to get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Troy Miller, and I'm the Associate Director for Research and Policy with the Florida College Access Network and host for today's webinar. I have a few quick notes for us before we begin. Everyone participating in the webinar today will be muted during the webinar, but please feel free to use the chat feature in the control panel to ask questions. And we look forward to getting to those during Q&A at the end. As always, we are recording the webinar for on-demand viewing, so each one of you attending the webinar will get a copy of the slides and a recording of the presentation sometime later this week, as well as anyone else who happened to register for the webinar. So the topic today is understanding credentials, and joining us in just a little bit is Dr. Jeff Stroll, who is Director of Research at Georgetown University's Center on Education and the Workforce. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone who registered. We had over 100 leaders in education stakeholders registered, representing Broward, Duval, Orange, Leon, Brevard, Sarasota, St. Johns, Miami-Dade, Monroe, Polk, Hillsborough, Pinellas, Collier, Palm Beach, Escambia, and Immokalee counties, among others, I'm sure. We also have some of our partners joining us from other states as well, so welcome everyone. Today's webinar will be about college and workforce credentials, a topic important to us all for obvious reasons, but one we'll be learning more about as we take a step back and discuss the skills associated with different credentials and why some are more valuable than others, and it's in addition to answering questions from those of you who are listening in. For those of you not familiar with Florida Can, our organization was created from a cross-sector alliance of national, state, and local stakeholders of higher ed to help build communities' capacity to increase their students' college and career readiness, access, and success. In doing so, our mission is to create and strengthen a statewide network that catalyzes and supports communities' ability to do so, in establishing local hubs to support the work, which we refer to as local college access networks, or LCANs. Local college access networks in Florida currently include 9 regions spanning 22 counties, which serve about half of our state's student population. Our big goal, or goal 2025, is to increase the percentage of working age adults in Florida who hold a high-quality post-secondary degree or credential from 39% to 60% by the year 2025. According to labor economists, like the one we'll be hearing from shortly, the 60% threshold is an important one to meet, as workforce projections show this is the percent of future jobs that will require some form of post-secondary education. This slide gives you all a quick glance of some of the important work happening around the state among communities who have come together to set goals to improve outcomes for their local students. If you're interested in learning more about LCANs or would like to consider convening local leaders in your community, please reach out to us. Our contact information will be located at the end of the presentation. One of our strategies for boosting post-secondary attainment in Florida is through our data research and policy work. Helping our partners increase their knowledge base and provide answers to questions with research and data is critical to our mission in helping students succeed. One of the most frequently asked questions we get asked as we travel around the state is related to how states and communities develop and implement an attainment goal, which brings us to the topic we'll be discussing this afternoon. In a Sunshine State survey poll released by the University of South Florida and Nielsen this month, Floridians stated that the most important issue facing the state is jobs and the economy. As you can see in the chart above, the ability to secure a well-paying job in Florida is strongly associated with one's level of education or training. And unfortunately, in Florida, the majority of our residents have not acquired the credentials outlined in the previous slide. According to U.S. Census data released last month, just under 40% of working-age adults in Florida have an associate's degree or higher, which is up 1% from the previous year, but leaves us slightly below the national average. This is of concern to many community and economic developers throughout the state, as businesses are increasingly looking at the local talent pool before making decisions to start, grow, or relocate their business. Florida has 9 of the top 100 most populated metro areas in the nation, but only 2 in the top 10 in degree attainment. These figures do not include certificates and other workforce credentials because of the limitations with the data, but we do acknowledge that there are many, many more that offer value in the workplace. Here's a quick overview of Florida's degree attainment data by age and race and ethnicity. Florida has a lot of improvement in these areas and will need to do so to meet our demand for higher levels of education and workforce training in the future. Based on our calculations, taking into account population increases, our state will need to provide access to over 719,000 additional credentials to Florida working age adults by 2025 to meet our demand. In the black is our current level of production based on our state's historical performance, which falls about 7 percentage points short of our 60% goal if our modest increases hold steady. All this work is heavily informed by the work of today's speaker, Jeff Stroll, who works with the Georgetown Center on Education in the Workforce. The Georgetown University Center on Education in the Workforce is an independent nonprofit research and policy institute that studies the link between education, career qualifications, and workforce demands. Jeff is the director of research at Georgetown, the Georgetown University Center on Education in the Workforce, where he continues his long involvement in the analysis of education and labor market outcomes and policy. He leads the center's research investigating the supply and demand of education and how education enhances career opportunities for today's workforce. Dr. Stroll, thank you very much for joining us. Give me just a moment here to unmute you and go ahead and give you control of the presentation.
All right. All right, can you see it now?
We can see it, thank you.
All right, let me see if I can make this blow up here or not. Sorry. Can you see that still?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and especially knowing how badly part of your state has been slammed. I can imagine many of you have bailing out on your minds rather than education goal setting. So, you know, thank you for taking the time. And then just one short answer, when we should dive into this much more, to Troy's question of what makes a certificate or a credential valuable in labor market terms, of course, is how well it aligns with the labor market. And I think this is there's a simple answer and, as you all know, a very detailed answer, a very difficult answer, especially for those of you who are familiar with SIP-SOC crosswalks. It's just we don't have a kind of laser beam alignment between our programs and labor markets, with maybe the exception of some of our shorter-term degrees. So anyways, thank you again. And the best way that I find for these types of webinar presentations to go is to hope and pray that people will have questions, because putting forth the data, et cetera, can just be boring. And I find that the things that we do here at the center are the best things we do are when we're answering questions and working with people who are on the ground to try to help come up with ways to utilize data and various methodologies to help address questions that you want to answer, not necessarily about what we want to do. So the work we do nationally maybe is a guidepost, but your questions are really the end goal. So hopefully we'll keep that in mind as we go. I like to start a presentation with where it's ending, just in case I get off track. And I think it's very important as we look at data like these and talk about goals, that there's real ownership at the state level, meaning that the data really has to pass the state smell test. You all know what's reasonable in your state. When analysts like myself evaluate or look at things happening at a state, sub-state level, we are using secondary data that's depersonalized. It's an industry name, you know the employer. It's a zip code, you know the program. It's a job, you know the people looking for them. So the things that we're talking about are really data guiding ground level work, which is this mix of quantitative and qualitative work. So when the stuff that I'm going to show is through that lens. It's a national perspective on your state. So skepticism is heartily, it's well received on my part because I learn a lot in that regard. And what we're talking about needs to be run through how you see the data and how your state offices or your institutions look at your own data, which some of which is proprietary and therefore much more timely, reliable, detailed than the stuff that I'll get at the national level. The other takeaway is the idea as we start to look at projections is thinking about the art of picking winners versus medium-term planning. And I'll go into this in a lot more detail. But the U.S. labor market and its relationship with education is one that uses labor market, free market institutions to kind of regulate the outcomes. We don't have a centrally planned economy of which we can, do a 5-year plan and say thou shalt make, 27 HVAC engineers and 32 of this, that, and the other things. There's a lot of forces that move us in these directions, and so we in the United States take a kind of a policy perspective of what's called indicative planning, use data to guide us and let the markets resolve some of the very specific thing at the time of need. And I think this is important as we think about areas of implementations of goals. I like to say, the politicos set the goals and then ground troops kind of are stuck with implementation. And implementation is really getting down into a lot of these details, and some of them are just how far forward can we pick winners, and I think we can talk about that more if people have questions about short and medium-term projections. And then, as I'm saying here in the last point, goal setting, it's a whole new ball game when we move into implementation. We've just seen so much from around the country how people are approaching this. That the great quote I heard is, once you've seen one state, well, you've seen one state. And I suspect with my experience in Florida, it'll probably be the same for you also. So on this point, let me find a little water here. On this point of state ownership, understanding the data and agreeing with the results is so critical. I run into many cases where people get handed a goal and the people even making the goals don't understand why it is they have what it is. And so I hope to touch on a little bit of that about why and how it is that we've seen an increasing need for post-secondary education. But I'll touch it lightly. We have it in many reports, and I'm happy to follow up on email about, grueling historic details. And this is really where state data systems and state intelligence are really critical to the fine-tuning and the forward-looking evaluation of where a goal is going. And I think this is something to be thinking about as we set goals. I think there's 2 steps: agreeing on a baseline and then coming up about good ways to measure progress. And I think personally that most of the goal-setting challenges before us really aren't about setting baselines, but really are about how we measure going forward. So I think it's really important. So anyways, this idea about balancing the art of picking winners versus medium-term planning. I mean, projections, they give us guidance. They aren't giving us winning numbers to the lottery. It's just not going to happen. It gives us good ideas about general magnitudes of order about where things are going. And so the primary question we get when we're talking to people is really, which programs are going to provide the jobs in 2025? I don't think we're well suited to answer that degree of specificity if the end goal is for the governor's office to start telling the individual institutions that you need to produce 27 of Program A and 3,500 of Program B. I think this is tough business when you're looking 10 years out, and I think that type of program specificity, as I'll get into, is really something we should reserve for the closer we are to the labor market, and I'll explain that a little bit more. The thing that we do see that I think is maybe counterintuitive to what you hear in the news is that we really don't see as much unpredictable change when it comes to jobs themselves as we do in job titles. We always hear that, most of the jobs today never existed yesterday. Sure, the job titles don't exist, but I think that many of the functions and tasks that we're talking about that underlie job title have actually been fairly stable, and if they haven't been stable, their growth has been predictable. You can take a look at the existing evidence we have on underlying competencies, tasks, technologies, and they trend fairly well with the present narratives about soft skills that we need, critical thinking things we need, etc. And this really boils down to understanding and thinking about where we're talking about tasks and activities and where we're talking about underlying competencies. And here I like this example of Fortran, and now almost dead programming language, versus algorithmic thinking, right? We know fairly well, and I think it's proven out historically as computers have become integrated, that we need people who can figure out how to program. If you want me to predict which computer language is going to be hot tomorrow, I mean, that's tough, right? For those of you who are in this part of the market, I mean, last week it was HTML, now it's Ruby on Rails, who knows what's next. But the underlying portion of algorithmic thinking is there, and so this is, I think, something we just need to think about when we think about how higher education, and you all as, I think, primarily higher educators, if my read of the list of people who are on this webinar is correct, that, what role does higher education play in preparing people for the workforce? And I do think it's dual. I think it's preparing foundations so that people are able to learn on the job, and in some cases, many cases, it's also preparing students for jobs that are going to exist close to when they graduate. And none of the people we're talking about in post-secondary today are going to be graduating in 2025, right? So we have to figure out what to do with this sort of time disconnect. So this is one thing that's really important to understand, and I really don't think people at the political level understand this. And this is, there's real critical time lags between labor market requirements and education production. People hear, well, gee, a petroleum engineer is a great job to get. You earn $1 gazillion a year. They say, I want to become one. They enter in school. 6 years later, they graduate. And petroleum engineers could be totally gone by that point. It could be solar engineers or whatever. And so reconciling ourselves to this aspect of the labor market and preparing people for jobs is important, especially in setting expectations about what it is that higher education's role should be in goal setting. And I really think that I think it's the Department of Labor's occupational competency models give us a way to start to think about this. And this is just one example, and it's just the idea that as we get closer to the labor market, we're building on a foundation of competencies that, in my mind, prepare people for the workplace and prepare them for two things. Prepare them for being flexible in response to quickly changing labor markets with global competition, etc. And, the idea of being able to learn, right? The tasks that you start off with aren't always the tasks that you finish with on a job. And then there is this aspect of higher education, or education in general, which is, somebody's about to graduate. They've got a year left. They've got to pick on which type of final capstone courses, thesis, all this type of stuff. And this is really where I think higher education can do a good job of picking winners, right? There's a lot of good information about, increasing high demand areas, high vacancies, etc., that, are within a year to 2 years of someone graduating, and I think you can be fairly confident about those. No, I don't think you can be down to the decimal point, and this is something we always have to balance when data comes out with numbers of 4,337, right, or whatever, that those numbers are really magnitude of order, and we have to remember that they're never going to be exact, and I think it's because of these time lags here. So anyways, I think this model, especially if you frame it across time and distance from the labor market, is a good way to sort of think about segmenting the roles of what higher education can be doing and perhaps should be doing for preparing the workforce for the jobs of next year, 5 years, and 10 years out, right? And so for the 10 years out jobs, I really would be in these lower echelons, being prepared to understand changing competency, what's going on, what's trending, where are the longer-term trends in soft skills going? This idea, is algorithmic thinking going to be a dominant skill that most people need to know? Is some type of base technology competency going to be something people need to know, right? So these are things we need to think about, and I think there's a growing body of work that will help us look at that. So the one thing that is constant is this idea that we've had an increasing education requirements, especially, most of the century, but in particular since around '83, we've had an idea of what's called skill-biased technological change, and this is the idea that the work processes, not just computers, I think that was a limiting thought that I used to have, and my boss has introduced me the idea this also includes work processes, team building, just-in-time inventorying, global networking, things that require a certain set, wider set of skills that are normally correlated with higher educational demands, right? You need a higher level of cognitive training to juggle all these pieces. So I think that's important. We use wages. So when we hear that people who will argue that people are just buying degrees, I don't have the data here, but happy to share or talk to people about it. The data that we have suggests that in almost all cases, around 80% of all employment, that an increase in education inside of an occupation leads to higher levels of productivity. Some of this is reflective that our occupational code are actually aggregations of a wide variety of job titles with a lot of educational variation across employers. But if you look at the data, the earnings tell us, which is a marker of productivity, tell us that the higher education level is in most cases more productive. And the argument I make here is that the employer community might make a mistake one year and buy a degree that's not more productive than the alternative, but they wouldn't be doing this for 40 years in a row. So there's something about higher education that is beneficial to the productivity of most, but not all, but most employers. And I think that we need to, look at, and we don't look enough at this, at how, PhDs, for instance, have to have support staff to create a productive unit of work, right? Because our old measures of productivity go back to manufacturing, miss the modern workplace. And there is an integration of a spectrum of educational skills required to take services and other things to market that has been probably undervalued. But anyways, so here's just an idea, about how upskilling has hit even areas of agriculture, and as well as production. I think good examples can be seen in CAD/CAM manufacturing. U.S. manufacturing employment has bottomed out. It used to be 32%, it's around 9% today, but we've maintained a solid share of value add to the global economy. You have a case, I believe, of more skilled workers using more automation, leading to higher levels of productivity and that increased post-secondary requirement. An example that I like to use resonates for me because I used to have a 50 Chevy that you could fix with the duct tape and a set of safety pins. That if you look at auto mechanics from around 68 to 70, I had to do a pooled sample to around 2007. This is from an older report. You see that we've moved completely away from high school dropouts and fairly solidly towards associate degrees. And if you think about it, back to my 1950 Chevy example, you know, I can't fix a modern car. You really need to understand, you know, computer diagnostics to do almost anything with a modern automobile. And actually, if you look at the occupational code, it used to be auto mechanics and repairmen, and today it's auto technician. So that's just one example, but I have data that demonstrates that this actually holds across a much wider body of occupations. So now, just with that as a background, I just want to move briefly and quickly through some thoughts about implementation of education goals as your state begins the process, I believe, of figuring out how to set it, what to set as a goal, and then I think some of your interest will be in then what the heck do we do to get there? Well, the devil in the details. I think that there are a lot of issues in the sub-baccalaureate space, as we call it here, that are a mush of certificates, certifications, licensing, and apprenticeships, and some of which are officially in the bailiwick of higher education, and a lot of it is actually unofficially in the bailiwick of higher education. We have a fair bit of storytelling evidence that a lot of certifications preparations happens through non-credit preparation on the community college campuses. We know that certifications link to licensure. We have evidence that certificates and apprenticeship tie together. I'm not exactly sure how things work in your state, but nationally this is the case. So you'll see that this whole some college sub-baccalaureate space is a really important component as we think about how to think about goal setting, because there's a lot of unknowns in here. Historically, we've not measured awards in this space very well. Those of you who use the National Clearinghouse, they've only recently gotten to about 50% coverage on certificates. National survey data has just started adding these as questions, so we don't have an awful lot of good understanding, and especially really good understanding at the state level, which revolves backwards to state data, state practitioners, and this balance between qualitative and quantitative. I think we need multi-methods to sort this thing out. Another question that you all are going to need to ask yourself, and especially as the state sets a goal, often goal setting is done on a 25 to 64-year-old population. The higher education system, even if you count for transformation towards non-traditional students, really is only dumping out into the labor market between 1 and 3 percentage points of the stock of education. So it's really unfair, I believe, to demand that higher education be solely responsible for movement of the entire stock of education to a goal. It's understandable and reasonable to demand, at least under state dollars and state appropriations, that there be some efficiency gains. And I'm not saying that with any knowledge about efficiency across the Florida institutions, but nationally I know that there is an efficiency problem if we look at graduation rates by test score as correlated by education dollars spent, right? So I'm assuming that there's some places for efficiency improvement, but that alone is not going to resolve getting Florida to a goal, unless the goal is where you already are, right? So this is something that needs to be balanced. I don't want it to be an excuse not to accept a challenge, right? Because a lot of goal setting, I think, is aspirational. Another question that really needs to be asked is the idea of what is value. We at the center, well, we start off with labor market valued credentials with labor market value, high valued credentials, and this presupposes a metric, a threshold, a way to measure this, and the easy thing is wages. Not everybody wants to do that, nor should they. The people in your state, the stakeholders and yourself need to come to some consensus about what you mean by value. So for instance, I ask the question often when we're talking about certificates, if a certificate takes someone from deep poverty to near poverty, have you done a good thing? And I think the answer to that question is one you need to address as you think through how we're going to do value. There's other stuff, which is the mechanics of, well, we use 20% as a labor market threshold for valued certificates because it relates through some empirical work to around 2 years of post-secondary education with what we call a sheepskin effect, the extra value for having a credential. But, you know, what about 1 year certificates, right? And so does my 20% threshold, should you be using it on 1 year certificates? You know, so these are questions that you need to answer. Other states are doing stuff with what I call intellectual and caring professions, doing some kind of discounting for traditionally low-paid and often female-dominated occupations. Other people are doing stuff trying to figure out if a credential, but doesn't matter which one, leads to a career pathway. They're considering it to be good. So these are really core questions that need to get hashed out before you even worry about which programs you should be working on, right? So you have to have some kind of, at least in my mind, you can always think differently. So looking at Florida, you know, thinking about implementation, you have to ask yourself, is a theoretical 60% goal for the state reasonable? If we look at Lumina's Stronger Nation, where they're looking at degree attainment and even threw in an estimate on certificates, gets you to 45.9 in 2014. Well, oops, sorry, oops, sorry. Okay, takes you to, you know, around 46%. So 14 percentage points over 10 years is a bit of a stretch, frankly. Historically, I looked at Florida's growth on AA and above from 1992 to 2012, and the state averaged around 0.7 percentage point growth per year. It's been a little slower in the recession/recovery period, but that's the longer-term trend. So if that's the case, add 7% to 46 gets you to sorry, 53. I'm an economist, not a good mathematician. So you've got to, in that framework, you have about 7 percentage points of aspirational goal. But another way to look at this, which is really important, is understanding whether or not, or coming to grips with some college, no degree, looking again at the data in Lumina's Stronger Nation State Report from the American Community Survey. You do see that Florida, including some college, no degree, has an attainment of 59.9. So if all of that some college, no degree was to be included, well, you're 0.1 percentage points away from your goal. So again, here are two bookends that give you an idea about ways to look at the goal. So this really points out the importance of some college. As a sidebar note, for those of you interested, the American Community Survey includes less than 1 year of some college, while the current population survey does not. And I think need to just think this through, because there could be a tendency for that less than 1 year to pick up some of the people who just show up on campus. But anyways, so this some college, no degree becomes really, really important as we think about what we can do to move towards the goal. And some of this is just down in the dirt sleuthing. How much of some college no degree, which again includes apprenticeship, certificates, non-credit education, how much of that is the credit of the higher education institutions? If Florida is like other states, there's an awful lot of unrecognized human capital development that goes on in the 2- and 4-year sector and the educational institutions that nobody gets, the institutions don't get credit for. We know that certifications, people are using their college campus to prepare for the exams. I'm not sure how you all deliver certificates, etc. So there's a lot here. The answers are tough. My work shows in general that about half of the some college no degree space, if you will, and this is getting AA is not there, returns labor market value with at a 20% premium. So as one bar, but again we have this 1 year issue. What to think about certifications, which I think get to be very interesting. I use a 8% threshold for certifications to determine labor market value. But again, I want to encourage you all to think about what else you would want to include for measurement of value. This chart, which is from our recovery report on Florida, shows openings by educational demand. And here again, you can really see how important some college no degree is. If you throw it out and decide it's no better than a high school diploma, then you're really well short of the goal. You get that 46%. And if you include some or all of it, you're really close to your goal. So you can see that it's really a tip-over point that we know in every state we're dealing with needs an awful lot more investigation to really address. I mean, the stuff we've done on certificates can give you guidance, but the answers to which ones in which programs and how they link to labor markets is very much a state-specific analysis and research program. The state should be, and as I know from some people in the state, they historically have looked at these kind of alignment issues. So hopefully they're cracking down on the certificates area to help sort this out. So now on a couple of closing notes. Let me do a little more water here. Something to understand about projections. Policy changes and changes in economic development strategy change the value of projections. Projections are an assumption that yesterday is a good description about tomorrow. I mean, we trend it, we look, it's like the last 3 days, it's been warmer by a degree, so tomorrow's probably going to be a little warmer. So we get some trend, right? So we get something. But once somebody comes in and makes a major policy change, this disrupts current projections and moves us into what I call a simulation framework. We've been working with the state of Mississippi to try to reconcile projections data with some sectorial goal setting that they've been doing and trying to model out, okay, here's your projections as is, and then if you're successful getting in more automotive plants, this is how your education demand will change. So what I'm saying here is that the projections will guide you, because most of the time your economic development strategy doesn't cover all sectors, right? So there's this idea of dance with who brought you. a lot of education demand and job demand is driven by replacement jobs of existing corporations, firms, and employers in your state. It's not just about the next new firm. A lot of it is about the retirees, et cetera, and I don't mean people moving to Florida. I mean people retiring in the state. And so I have this example, this software example. This is a note. I'm working with another state. The potential governor, software magnate, you know, and he's got this great idea that he's going to talk to his buddies about bringing software into the state to replace a dying industry. That, you know, projections can't pick that stuff up. Projections can pick up ongoing discussions in the state, you know, where, let's say, for the last 5 years you've been trying to move from one type of tourism to ecotourism, right? You can pick that up because there's been an ongoing discussion that informs projections. But something out of the blue that's totally new disrupts projections. And I think you need to keep that in mind as you move forward. And I think the best way to keep that in mind is some type of annual, every 3 or 5 year readjustment about your role in achieving a goal. And that's one way to do that. And again, this is back to the idea of the education for me, a lot of it's preparing the workforce to be flexible in response to changes that are a little difficult to predict in a market economy. We can do some of them. You know, I feel pretty confident, for instance, about using internet job postings data to give you a 6-month projection on jobs that will be there, but I can't use it to do 6 years, right? So we need to find this balance as we do, and you know, multi-methods, I think, is an interesting way to look at it. So I think this is about the closing here. I think questions that you need to address is, you know, how to include certifications. They're very, very hard to measure. They often don't have a Social Security number, but they're commonly linked to licenses. So that means there is a state regulatory administrative mechanism that means you can kind of track them, and there is Perkins funding and some other things out of K-12 that enables that. There's some movement that might make them Title IV eligible in our lifetimes, who knows. But on the other hand, the data that I have, which is limited, shows little evidence that certifications have a lot of standalone economic value. They do, but not a lot, and that they add a marginal value. But then they also add significant value to all levels of education, high school up to a PhD. So they're important, but if you're just counting highest attainment, they get absorbed a lot by other degrees. So you've got to sort that one out. And I think what to do with non-credit education and some other items that the education system supplies to the labor market, and, you know, customized training, etc. But it doesn't fall into our normal buckets and therefore is not counted. So it's something to, you know, sort through. I don't have an answer for it, but I think these are the discussions that once we move from a gubernatorial aspirational goal to what the heck do we do now world, that addressing these questions will be next up. And I just leave this with my email, of which Troy is quite welcome to pass around. I'm quite happy to do follow-up email questions, phone calls. We've worked a lot with Florida, so you all just, you know, let me know, and hopefully from this there are some questions. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for your great information and insight. We've got a lot of questions racked up, so I'd like to get to those while we have plenty of time. It looks like to get through those. Someone asked the question: are there other studies that separate the incomes of certificate earners from others in the category of some college but no degree?
Yes. We do earnings in our 2012 report by what we call meta majors, and then there's a growing number of states that are using their state longitudinal data systems to report certificates earnings by program, and in some cases by institutions. I'm not 100% sure what Florida's doing in this case. And then there will be the newest iteration of the gainful employment data will be hitting the streets very shortly. Many of those things suffer from, and not in a bad way, but recognize that they commonly are 1, 3, or 5 year earnings, so they don't get you to those kind of pathway earnings.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question out there. Yeah, Jeff, there have been labor economists that have been, looking at projection type data for decades. The labor economists in the, perhaps 30s and 40s and 50s looking at what jobs would look like in the 80s, 90s, et cetera. Has there been anyone that's looked at kind of how those projections kind of in the past have done with estimating the kinds of education and training that would be required for those future jobs?
Not on the education portion, with the exception of some work that we've done that you'll find in the appendix of our Help Wanted report, which is our first projections of education demand. And there's a historic reason for this. The projections efforts are a offshoot of veteran reentry after World War II, and they were used for counseling. Here's a job, and then help them get to the job via GI Bill stuff. They didn't introduce educational requirements into the data until about, I think, 1996. These data were never meant to measure education demand. They were meant to, and have always been, entry-level education requirements. If you look at the data, you'll see that they have like a 0.01 change, 0.01 percentage point change in educational requirements every decade, which is frankly ridiculous if you look at the wage gains and the actual what happened in the labor market. We have done robustness testing on our demand model. So our demand, we take 25 years of educational requirements with inside major occupation groups and project that forward. To test for robustness, we build the model to around 2003 or 4, and then project forward to like 2012, or most recently we built it to around 2004 or 5, and then projected to the current data around 2014 to see whether or not we were being accurate. And we've got about a plus or minus 5% on the overall projections, which in this world is pretty darn good. There are issues with, there's work that BLS does that looks at the projected reliability of their occupation and job categories, which historically has had problems. And this really gets back, in my mind, to the kind of picking winners issue. It's something, again, that we haven't focused on, but if you look again at the data and the earnings that what we use to validate it, the idea of upward trending education demand seems to hold with all evidence we can look to substantiate it.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question regarding, some of the issues that you raised earlier about states taking a closer look at this kind of data. They're wondering if there's a particular state or region that you would consider as serving as a model for this process of goal setting and sleuthing through the data and implementing a goal.
Yeah, that is a great question, and the answer is yes, but back to my comment about once you've seen one state, you've seen one state. In the last year or so, I've been primarily focused on the certifications and certificates world and talking to states about measurement issues there. And there are a number of people who are state practitioners, and so they're good folks for you all to talk to, because they understand interagency agreements and, silos and all this kind of stuff. And so if Troy, if we can follow up with an email, I can provide a few links, some people to talk to for that area. The goal setting part, I need to know a little bit more, so perhaps offline someone, Troy or otherwise, can guide me about how you think things are shaping up. And the reason I'm framing it this way is there are some states that are solely doing labor markets and other states that aren't doing labor markets and a number of states that are half doing labor markets. And I think you need to resolve that. And there are a number of states that are linking this solely as a horse for the cart of economic development and bringing in new firms, and other places that are doing it back to this kind of allocation apportionment to individual campuses and what kind of role they can play. And I don't think in those cases that they pay enough attention to the importance of regional economic development. So I have answers for you, and I've got people that you can talk to in most of these cases, but I don't know the right answer. So Troy, let's just follow up or put whoever.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, fair enough. And we follow up with an email to everyone who registered with a copy of the slides and the recording of the presentation. We'll include your email address on there too, and some of the information that we might get from you afterwards with some of the advice that maybe you can help us follow up with. Someone is kind of asking, so I think, the reason why we all care so much about, workforce projections is to make sure that our future workforce is, best positioned to have the education or training they need to be able to have those jobs. So, consider perhaps a 12-year-old today, a middle schooler. We're talking about, some of this data that applies to the workforce in the year 2025 or beyond. How is it that this, this information kind of in theory, this projection type information, how is this best applied to, folks who maybe are out there who are school counselors or who are college advisors and wanting to make sure that, they are putting their own students or their fellow community members in the very best position possible to have these jobs that are projected to be there in the future?
Yeah, boy. I guess if I get the right answer to that one, I get my Nobel Prize on that one.
That's right.
Yeah. I think, again, going back to the occupational competency model, I think it serves well as a counseling tool, and I think it serves well as a planning tool. I mean, I think it's fairly ridiculous in the U.S. labor market to put somebody on a career pathway in 8th grade. It works in other countries. My wife is Italian. She got on a vocational track in, 8th or 9th grade, piped out. She happened to switch, which is extremely rare, but all of her friends, high school degrees, they got a house, they've had a job for 35 years. It can work there, but it doesn't work here. So I think we need counseling and development of identifiable soft skills and hard ones. You got to know how to add math. All those pieces are pretty darn important. So how to build those generalized competencies, and then the closer we get to the labor market, how do you then counsel? The thing that we've found, looking at some information on counseling, and I don't want to be even pretending to be an expert on practice, but we tend to see that it doesn't bring labor market information into the process early enough. And I think there's a little bit of evidence, not a lot of it, but a little bit, that if we were to use some of this labor market information about jobs and bring it in earlier, we might induce less major changes, which then might result in more persistence, quicker time to completion, and less cost. Because my understanding, and again, I'm no expert here, my understanding is that major change is expensive in the sense of time.
Yeah, We'll work on the Nobel Prize there, Jeff. I thought that was good, though. Um, Florida is one of the biggest states in the nation, obviously, and we have, over 150,000 high school graduates each year. One of the things that we've seen recently is a spike in the number of students who are receiving an industrial certification while in school. The percentage, I believe, has increased from somewhere around 4 or 5% to 23% in just a short amount of time. I was wondering, just to kind of get your reaction on kind of how you feel about this kind of approach from a state's perspective on, career readiness.
Well, I think it can be good. I would certainly like to know what the labor market outcomes are of those individuals getting a certification, because, like I said before, we barely know what we don't know about certifications, and it's a pretty there's a bit of Wild West to it. There's about 4,000 known certification providers. So the proof for us is, are they getting a job? Is it actually benefiting them in some way in the labor market? They seldom appear to have a benefit for educational transfer value, in particular because they're not currently Title IV eligible, I don't believe, and it's very, very seldom credit-based, right? So you don't have a credit transfer issue going on here, so it's got to be valued in the labor market. So there are some certifications that people have been creating, and it's not clear that there's a market for them. And there's other certifications that are, like my brother-in-law is a crane operator. His certification got him a job, right? It's a real necessity for a job. So the value of a good certification is that it's industry and employer recognized, and it is really critical to getting a job. And so as a workforce readiness strategy, it's great. If you're a local educational institution and you know the local economy and you know that the local employers are going to choose someone with that certification over someone without it, then, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. If those certifications are just noise in the market, right, that actually add less certainty rather than more certainty for the employer, then maybe we're doing a disservice to the student. So my answer would be, I'd love to see a lot more detail about what those certifications are and whether or not there's a difference between the employment labor market attachment of the people who are getting them, at least among the ones who are terminal high school students. So in theory, yeah, I think it could be great. I mean, it's just like I think apprenticeship could be great. But I'd like to see a little more.
All right, Jeff. Here's a lightning round because we have about a minute left, and I want to try to get to 2 questions. What in one word or less? How about your response to what we experience sometimes, which I would probably call like the backlash to 4-year degrees or liberal arts degrees? What do you have to say to folks who you tend to interact with in your work around 4-year degrees and liberal arts degrees?
I'm a little unclear about what the issue is. I mean, are they good, you mean?
Yeah, I would say in our interactions with folks at times, there's a whole lot of emphasis on the industry certifications and the post-secondary certificates, and because whether it's the cost or some other factor, I think with some there has been, for whatever reason, a motivation to downplay the need or necessity for a 4-year degree or a liberal arts degree.
Okay, I got you. There's clear demand for BAs. BAs have been, I personally believe that the sub-baccalaureate market has achieved an equilibrium. If you look at the real wage growth nationally, I don't have Florida in front of me, it's been fairly, it's been steady. There's been gains, but it's been slow. If you look at the wage premium for BAs, it's skyrocketed, indicating to us a lot of unmet demand and productivity increases. if you were to just take a random draw like the lottery and reached in to find a BA holder, they're doing better without the BA than they are without it, and significantly so compared to an AA, or in particular in comparison to a high school degree. A liberal arts major does fine if you look at the data. I mean, there's issues about occupational choice, but sure, they don't earn like an engineer, but they earn at or above the median U.S. family income. I mean, they're doing pretty good. And if you look at the data over time, BAs are, college degrees are the key to middle class family sustaining earnings.
All right, thank you so much, Jeff. This was a real pleasure to have you on with us this afternoon. It was one of our most information-rich presentations I think that we've had. So thank you very, very much, Jeff, for joining us.
You're welcome, and I encourage follow-up.
You bet. We'll do that. Just a couple of notes while we wrap up very quickly. If you're interested in looking closer at some of the data that we've been referencing around post-secondary and academic outcome data, we've got lots of resources on our website. There's actually a Twitter chat that's being hosted by the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce that's starting now, talking about equity in higher ed. So feel free to hop over onto Twitter and follow them. This webinar will be posted to our website and emailed to all of you attending and those others who've registered. We have another webinar coming up next week on FAFSA completion efforts with a whole host of experts. So please refer to our website on our event page, that information there. And we'll have a follow-up to this webinar early in November on Florida workforce trends with a state expert, and an invitation on that will be forthcoming. We hope you might consider submitting a presentation to propose at our summit, so please save the date on that. Think about a topic that you might think we all would benefit from. The deadline for that is approaching November 1st. I want to thank our sponsors for making webinars like this possible. Thank you, Helios Education Foundation and Swift Family Foundation. And of course, don't forget to visit our website to sign up for future releases, newsletters, and webinar announcements. Thank you all very, very much for your questions and engagement and joining us this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day.